Hello and welcome to Lecture 44 in our History of Ancient Rome. In this and the next lecture I want to turn our attention to the religious life of the empire, a very important part of ancient Roman culture. In this lecture I'll examine Roman paganism, and in the next we'll look at the rise of Christianity. As I mentioned at the start, the Christian church is one of the most direct links between, if not the most direct link, between our age and the ancient Roman age. Paganism was a very diverse phenomenon, and given the geographic extent and the longevity of the Roman Empire, it came in many different shapes and sizes. It would be impossible to survey all the various forms of paganism in the ancient empire in this format. So I want to restrict my comments primarily to Roman state religion, to the religion that was practiced and honoured by the officials of the Roman state and recognised as being the primary modes of worship and the primary deities that were worthy of worship by the officials and by the Roman state as a whole. We'll come to other varieties of pagan worship, perhaps when we look at the competitors to Christianity and the rise of Christianity in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD the next time. So let's be clear at the start that my comments today are aimed primarily at the Roman state religion, so-called state religion. The first thing to get our minds clear about is that the ancient Roman gods, the pagan gods, were quite different from the dominant modern deities. The dominant religions of the modern age are religions of ethics, moral fibre, dogma and teachings. They're often religions of the book. The ancient Roman gods were not really concerned about moral matters and ethical matters. They weren't entirely unconcerned by them. For instance, Jupiter was a god who was a guardian of travellers and people who were hosts, guests in people's houses. And if you maltreated the guest, then you risked calling down the wrath of Jupiter on your head. So they did have some ethical or moral interests, but they weren't really overly concerned with the ethical or moral behaviour of individuals, of their worshippers. That's a big difference between the ancient gods and the deities of modern religion. Rather, the ancient deities were ultimately and primarily gods of natural forces: earth, wind, sky, earthquakes, and growth, and so on and so forth. So all the natural forces that one observes around one would be ascribed in ancient Roman pagan thought as a province to a particular deity. Gradually, as time went on, they also came to be associated with human endeavours and the vicissitudes of human life, and especially those enterprises that were uncertain or risky in their outcomes, such as war, obviously, or making an important decision about the running of the state, or the planting of a crop. How will the crop turn out? Or, of course, risky endeavours like giving birth or embarking on a marriage. How is that going to work out? So the gods also came to have provinces in the sphere of human endeavours as well. To put it in a nutshell, the ancient pagan gods could influence the outcome of any process, natural or human, that was risky, uncertain or incomprehensible. Okay? As a result of this outlook, the Romans had multiple deities. We are familiar perhaps with the deities often called the Olympian gods, which came to be associated with the Greek Olympian gods: Jupiter, for instance, god of the sky; Venus, the god of sex; Mars, the god of war; Neptune, the god of sea, horses and earthquakes, and so on and so forth. But the Romans also acknowledged thousands of other minor deities that came in an enormous variety and influenced much more limited spheres of activity. There was, for instance, Consus, the god of stored grains, because obviously stored grains are things that can go bad, so there must be a deity who would look after the stored grains and ensure that when you want to use them, they're still going to be there and they won't have all gone rotten. There was Flora, who was the goddess of fruits and crops. And there was even a god called Robigus, who was the god of mold and rust. If you imagine a ancient Roman looking at a perfectly good piece of farm equipment and comes back 2 years later, it's gone all rusty and is no longer usable, that's a process that's incomprehensible. It must be a deity, and the god Robicus was in charge of rust and mold, that which sort of deteriorates something that's useful. This breakdown of the gods could go to quite extreme levels, which reveals quite a lot about the Roman pagan mentality and outlook on the world. Just to take the doorway. Well, the doorway had an overarching god called Janus. And Janus is normally, by the way, portrayed as having two faces, one on the front and one on the back of the head to represent the doorway, which looks both ways. And so the month January is named after him, since the month January, the first month of the year, looks backward on the old year and forward on the next year. Anyhow, Janus is in charge basically of the entire doorway, but there were three other deities involved as well. There was Limentinus, who was the god in charge of the step, of the threshold stone, so to ensure that you wouldn't trip over it or something on your way in or out of the doorway. There was the goddess Cardea, who was in charge of the hinges that kept the door in place so the door wouldn't fall on you when you went through the door. And there was the god Forculus, who was in charge of the actual leaf of the door itself. So no less than 4 deities concerned just with the doorway. So this is the sort of breakdown that goes on that tells us a lot about how the Romans would assign ever more increasingly narrow provinces to specific deities. In nature, the pagan gods of the Romans were anthropomorphic. They were modeled on human beings. They were considered to look like humans. They were generally bigger and better looking than humans were. And, not necessarily more intelligent, but certainly bigger and better looking. But they were also, and this is what's most important about them, they were also subject to the full gamut of human emotions. They were capable of anger, lust, deceit, love, happiness, and so on and so forth. So they were quite capricious in the way they behaved, just as any human being could be. But being in charge of natural forces and human endeavours, the effects of their deceit and their anger and their lust had much wider ramifications than was the case for your average person. Rather like humans, the gods could be conceived of as occupying specific places. There was Jupiter Capitolinus, Jupiter of the Capitol. He was actually considered as living on the Capitol. That's where he actually physically was, and he could move around. Or you had Apollo Palatinus, Apollo who was living in his temple on the Palatine Hill in Rome and so forth. So again, gods could be actually considered to occupy specific locations. And what they wanted, what they asked of their worshippers more than anything else, were two things. They wanted recognition and respect. What they wanted was for the humans to recognize their existence and their authority over their particular provinces. And one expressed one's recognition of the deity in terms of the state religion by establishing a cult, building a temple and establishing a cult with priests to monitor the needs of that particular deity. That said to the god, we recognize you, we are building a temple in your honor and establishing priests and priestesses or whatever to monitor to the rituals that nourish you. In terms of respect, you displayed respect by maintaining the cult and maintaining the temple in good shape. It wasn't good if the temple fell apart. It had to be maintained, and the upkeep of the cult, usually at state expense, was one way of showing the respect. But much more importantly, you must consult the deity whenever you embark on any enterprise that deity might have an effect over. Failure to do that was the chief way of irritating the gods. It was an act of arrogance to embark on a project without having gone through the proper rituals of consultation and ensuring that the deity was on side on your endeavour. You also showed respect by establishing communal festivals to certain very important deities, where the whole community as a group came out and recognized and respected the deity involved. A day would be set aside, and either the whole community or sections of it would take the day off work and show up. There'd be a procession, sacrifices and so on, various rituals in honor of the deity that the festival was dedicated to. That was another way, a sort of a communal way of showing respect to the most important deities in the Roman pantheon. Another feature of Roman religion that was not very much a feature of Greek religion, for instance, was animism. Animism is the belief that certain inanimate objects contain spirits. And chief among these inanimate objects for the Romans would be any bodies of water. Pools, lakes, streams, or springs. Springs are quite magical if you think about it. Water bubbling up out of the ground, cold and drinkable. That's evidently, for the ancient Roman mind, evidently a place of some divine power. Clearings in forests. If you're walking, ever walk through a dense forest and emerge into a clearing, there's a nice feel about that sort of a place. Well, that feeling the Romans associated with the divine presence in the area. So a clearing of a forest, or alternatively, in a relatively open area of ground, a copse of trees, or a cave. A cave also is a vaguely magical place. So these places were considered to have deities associated with them that are normally called nymphs. They're sort of like fairies. They're deities extremely localized in their concerns. A nymph of a spring would be only concerned about the welfare of that particular spring. But it meant that if you wanted to use the spring, then you had to show recognition and respect for that particular nymph, or else you risked disaster. The spring might dry up, or the water might go bad, or something. Now, before I move on, I just want to issue a caveat, which is that as inheritors of the Judeo-Christian polemic of the 4th and 5th centuries AD against ancient Roman paganism, we are inclined to regard all these sets of beliefs as somewhat silly and laughable and perhaps cute. We sort of condescend towards them and think it's also stupid in many ways. But we have to remember that paganism was a totally valid and vital religious system that for millennia succeeded in making understandable a difficult and very capricious world to millions and millions of people. And so, before we get on our high horse and condemn it all as all rather silly, we should remember that for centuries and centuries and centuries it helped explain the world to many, many people indeed, and there's no reason to believe, for instance, that pagans didn't take the religion seriously, or that they were just going through the motions without really believing any of it. It is a big issue of scholarly debate. How much did the Greeks or the Romans believe in their gods? But there's no reason to believe, just because their belief system is so alien compared to ours, that they didn't believe it and that they didn't take it seriously. For sure they did. Thousands of inscriptions tell us this. Inscriptions, dedications to gods in thanks for a job well done or something, show us again and again and again that the pagans did believe and respect their deities. In terms of religious observance, the chief function of religion, or the practice of religion in the Roman world, in the Roman pagan state religion, was essentially placatory and propitiatory. It was designed to placate the gods, obviate the chance of them getting angry, or if you had divined that their anger had already been roused, then trying to mollify that anger, or even better, to get them favorably disposed towards you and your proposed endeavor through a series of rituals. And as a result of this, ancient pagan worship was primarily formalistic and ritualistic. What was important was the form and the successful completion of prayers and rites of various sorts. What was in your heart, what was in your soul, if you want to think of it that way, didn't really matter that much. It was the outward shape of your acts that mattered. That's what the gods saw, and that's what they wanted from you, was the proper performance of rituals. And as a result, then, Roman religious practice is highly formalistic. The Romans expressed the relationship of humans to gods with two very interesting phrases. The overall relationship between the gods, the maintenance of the good favor of the gods, was termed the pax deorum, the peace with the gods. You maintained a peaceful and prosperous relationship with them. And they described the activities that one carried out and the attitude one displayed towards the god as pietas, piety in the English translation, but lacking completely the sense of piousness that we associate with the Judeo-Christian belief system. Pietas, rather, was the same word that was used to describe one's deference and respect towards one's elders, towards the pater familias in the house, and towards the state as a whole. So, in other words, the Romans conceived of their relationship towards the gods in the same way as they conceived the social and political relationships within their state, as a matter of superior forces who had to be brought on side through suitable displays of deference and respect. So in many ways, you could argue that the Roman pagan belief system mirrored their social and political order as we've already examined it. Predominantly three forms of ritual were observed: prayers, sacrifices, and divination, and we'll look at each of them in turn. Prayers were highly formulaic, basically contracts that you opened with a deity, and they were highly formalistic because you had to do the prayer correctly. Any mistake in any of these rituals, prayer, sacrifice, or divination, any formalistic error, a stutter or a stammer or a sneeze, or missing a word, or failing to use the right terminology, would invalidate the entire ritual, because you might risk offending the god, for instance. The basic form of a prayer was, first of all, to call on the deity that you wanted to address. And you could use a specific title. You could say, I want to call on Jupiter, specifically Jupiter Capitolinus. So you're going to say, I'm calling on Jupiter, Jupiter who lives in the Capitol. Or, if you were unsure how the god was feeling, you could add in a catch-all phrase like, or by whatever name you prefer to be called. As it's possible that Jupiter was being worshipped elsewhere in the empire under some other name, and that's the name that he was going by that day, and if you misused the name, then he simply wouldn't pay attention to your prayer. So you could say, I'm calling upon Jupiter, Jupiter of the Capitol, or by whatever name you wish to be called. That would be a good catch-all phrase to get the attention. That way Jupiter had to listen to whatever he wanted to say. Next thing you did was state your request. I'm calling on you because I want you to look favorably upon my journey to Pompeii from Rome or something, and keep me safe on that journey. But you wouldn't just state the request. You had to make a case, since gods, after all, are just forms of superhumans writ large. Then you had to make a case, so that you had to convince them, just as you would convince, say, a patron who you wanted to ask a favor. You'd have to give reasons. You'd have to say, in the past, I've shown you all due respect and worship. It's certainly within your power to grant me this favor. Why not do it now? You've done it before to others. Why not do it for me? Or you could cite precedent. Last time I made this journey, you kept me safe and well. Please do it again. Or an even better way to do it was to have a quid pro quo agreement. Do this for me, and when I come back safe and sound, I'll sacrifice for you, or I'll build you an altar, or I'll build you a shrine. So when you stated the request, you often had to make a case, try to persuade the deity to agree. And then the last part of the prayer was to fill in your part of the bargain. This was usually, it could often be folded into the statement of the request, but you would want to state what you would do. A god won't help you unless you'll do something for the god. And as I say again, it could be, if you're very affluent, you could promise to build a temple and establish a cult. But if you were just a poor farmer, you might say, I'm going to sacrifice a pig or a chicken or something when I come back. And we have examples of such prayers. I'm going to read you just a couple. The most interesting ones are those that are given to nymphs whose names are not known, and whose identity, whether they're male or female, and whose names are not known. And so the worshipper has to be sure to include a catch-all phrase. Here's a good one from Cato the Elder's book on agriculture. He says, when thinning a grove of trees, remember a group of trees is going to have a divine element in it. He says, when thinning a grove of trees, it is essential to observe the following Roman ritual. Sacrifice a pig as a propitiatory offering and repeat the following prayer. And you have to do this exactly. Whether you are a god or a goddess, to whom this grove is sacred, as it is proper to sacrifice to you a pig as a propitiatory offering for the disturbance of the sacred place. And therefore, for these reasons, whether I or someone I have appointed performs the sacrifice, provided that it be performed correctly, for this reason, in sacrificing this pig, I pray in good faith that you will be benevolent and well disposed to me, my home, my family, and my children. For these reasons, therefore, be honored by the sacrifice of this pig as a propitiatory offering. That's a perfect prayer. You've covered all the bases. He's even stated, in case I don't get a chance to make the sacrifice, whoever I appoint, look well upon that sacrifice. This brings us to the second main form of ritual, which is sacrifice. This strikes the modern mind as a very strange pattern of behavior, but it was performed thousands of times a day for millennia. The basic notion seems to have been that the deity was nourished by the sacrifice. In ancient thought, the sacrifice was actually thought to feed the gods. The gods are often presented as sniffing the smoke and gaining sustenance from it. That's in very ancient primitive pagan thought. It's less prominent in Roman thought, that sort of a notion. But the pattern of sacrifice, you're basically consigning the life force of an animal or a plant or the potency of wine over to the deity. And that's what sacrificium means. It means to make sacred, to make holy. This ritual was complicated. It involved bringing, if we were to say sacrificing a bull, you'd have to go along to the appropriate deity's temple, set up a date, then on the date you would bring the bull dressed in your official toga, in your official gear of citizenship. You would bring the bull, purchase it from the market, making sure that it was unblemished. Sacrificing, a three-legged bull to a deity would be an insult. So it had to be a perfect animal. Bring it along to the temple. Prayers would be said. As the prayers were said, normally a flute player would be there to help drown out any noises that might distract the priest as the priest says the prayer, so that the priest won't mess up the ritual. And people who were not welcome and unclean animals like dogs would be asked to leave. Prayers would be said outside the temple. The sacrifice would take place at an altar outside the front of the temple, usually with the doors of the temple open so that the state or so that the cult image could look out upon the sacrifice. And then after the prayers were being said, or even as the prayers were being said and the flute was being played, the animal would have a little bit of salt and flour dabbed on its forehead. That was the act of sacrifice, in fact. That was the making the animal sacred, consigning it over to the deity. Then, once everything was ready, the priest would instruct an attendant to hit the animal on the head with a hammer, which stunned it, brought it to its knees, and its throat was cut. And whatever happened to the blood, we don't know. It doesn't seem that it was used at all in the sacrifice. After that, it seems to have just gone to waste. And then the animal's innards were inspected, because the animal had to be unblemished and perfect outside and inside. And then the animal was butchered, and often it would be sold to butchers in the marketplace. All throughout this procedure, from the very moment of purchasing the bull, any number of things could go wrong that might risk invalidating the sacrifice. The bull could struggle, it mightn't die properly. The person making the sacrifice could be splashed with blood. That was a bad sign. Of course, any mistake could be made in the saying of the prayers. That was a bad sign, and so on and so forth. All, again, sacrifice, just like prayers, had to be conducted flawlessly and without mistakes. We hear that a mistake at a major Pan-Latin festival that lasted 3 days in 176 BC, a mistake was made in a ritual towards the end of the festival, and the whole festival had to be re-celebrated. Finally, we come to divination. This is the act not of seeing the future. I must stress that immediately. Divination is not looking at the future. Excuse me. It is looking at the disposition of the gods towards your proposed activity at that moment. It tells you how the gods are feeling about what you want to embark upon at the time that you ask them. It isn't considered to tell you what's going to happen. It just tells you whether you should proceed or not. If it comes out from the process of divination that the gods are not in a good mood today, then you probably shouldn't do what you're planning to do, whether it be hold a meeting of the Senate or betroth your daughter to a neighbour's son or whatever. The main forms of divination in the Roman state were augury, looking at birds. And you looked at birds either in flight. You could, consuls, for instance, would sit on a special seat and observe the sky and look at birds flying in different patterns in different directions, whether they were squawking, how high up or low down they were in the sky. All of this was taken into account. And there were also, sounds extremely ridiculous, but they also had sacred chickens that they kept in cages, and the chickens would be fed special cakes, and it would be watched very closely by augurs, by special priests who were skilled in interpreting these signs, how the chickens ate the cakes. If the chickens came out and really went at the cakes and bits fell from their beaks, this was an excellent sign. Obviously the gods were extremely well disposed, but if the chickens hung around the back of the cage and wouldn't eat the cakes and squawked and flapped their wings, then the gods weren't well disposed towards you, and you probably shouldn't proceed. We also hear as well that they would examine the entrails of animals, especially the liver, to look for blemishes. This was called haruspicy, the act of looking at the entrails, especially of sacrificial victims, to see how the gods felt about the sacrifice and whether it had been successful. The gods could also issue signs that were called omens or prodigia that were issued by the gods without being asked for. Aside from augury, looking at birds, and the act of haruspicy, looking at the guts of animals, the gods could issue unasked for signs, prodigies of all sorts, supernatural events, obviously comets or meteors, lights in the sky, but voices, booming voices emanating from temples, or children suddenly getting special abilities, or animals born with two heads or whatever. These would all be noted and would be considered signs from the gods. The religious staff of the Roman state is something that we've already alluded to and covered, so I don't intend to spend much time on it. But the religious staff of Roman state religion was comprised of the same people who made up the leaders, the social, political and military leaders of the state in every other respect. There was no separation of religious and state business. Far from it. They were considered to be one and the same thing. Before a Senate meeting, there would always be prayers and sacrifices and acts of divination. There were chief colleges of priests at Rome whose jobs it was to overlook the successful enactment of the various rituals and cults that comprised the state religion. The chief priests of all were the pontifices, and the president of the College of Pontifices, the Pontifex Maximus, was the chief priest of all of Roman state religion. But in addition, individual temples and cults had their own they had their own, often state-appointed priests and attendants who were specifically concerned with the operation of that temple and that cult. The four chief colleges were not really attached to any one cult. They just oversaw the whole ritualistic behavior of the Roman state. But it was the individual priests who were assigned to individual temples who looked after that particular deity's welfare. As a whole, then, the Roman state religion was a rather dignified and aloof business. The Romans looked down upon any religious belief that seemed to them excessive or fanatical. They called these sorts of beliefs superstition. People who went into trances or shamanistic sort of behavior would be scorned by them. This is clearly excessive behavior. The observance of religion was a dignified, stately business. It was done through the correct observance of ritualistic form. It wasn't a matter of drinking special potions and shaking and having visions. That was not something that they considered to be a dignified part of full religious belief, oracles aside. They were more concerned with the correct observance, outward observance of ritual. As a result of this pagan outlook, pagan religion was extremely tolerant. Now, by tolerant, I don't necessarily mean that the Romans had respect for every pagan cult, but they tolerated most cults that they encountered. They tended to accumulate and add the deities that they came across rather than try to stamp them out. They would turn their minds to bringing newly encountered deities on board, adding cults, and we hear them all the time, opening up new cults to Apollo or Asclepius or the Dioscuri or whatever gods or goddesses it was deemed should be recognized by the state for whatever reason. They often identified local state or local gods with well-established gods in the Roman pantheon, such as the Celtic goddess Sulis in England was identified with the Roman goddess Minerva and often called Sulis Minerva. They did, however, subject certain cults to persecution and to suppression, usually for political and social reasons. And of course, in our memory, chief among those was the Christian cult, and that is the subject of our next lecture, the rise of Christianity, and specifically its interaction with the Roman state religion and state practices.